So let's jump into chapter 5, Analyticism. In the following summary, I'm going to outline some of the key methodological and philosophical underpinnings of analyticism. For the most part, it might seem like I'm talking mainly about monism in general and not so much analyticism specifically. But I think it's since monism is in many ways so counterintuitive to us, and since we're also lacking the language in many ways, I think it's quite important to dedicate enough time and effort to establishing the monist outlook, and the following summary will surely also serve as a basis for understanding reflexivity, the other monist methodology in Jackson's 2x2. And I think especially in contrast between my summaries on analyticism and reflexivism, we can kind of start to understand both the overarching monist commitment but also the differences between the two. So yeah, let's jump in. So in analyticism, we're in the realm of monism and phenomenalism, and this is the first monist methodology that Jackson outlines, and the bulk of the chapter is dedicated to fleshing out what monism could look like. One of the major problems of showcasing monism is that due to the dominance of dualism that Jackson characterized at length in the previous two chapters. Due to that dominance of dualism, it feels like the common sense vocabulary of science and even the vocabulary for everyday life, the words we use, our language somehow seems to lend itself more to dualism. So in outlining monism, we oftentimes struggle with a lack of words. Sometimes some of the formulations that I'll be using, or even some of the formulations that Jackson uses, might sometimes seem like grammatically wrong or a bit bumpy. But yeah, that's the reason for that, because due to the dominance of dualism, just our language itself is so shaped by the dualist outlook on the world. So starting with some of the quotes from Waltz, and then also just some of the quotes from Jackson from the introduction of the chapter. There's, for instance, Waltz's quote that theories construct a reality, and that theories convey a sense of the unobservable relations of things, somehow implying an instrumental view of theory, and containing some notion of theories being quote unquote continuous with the quote unquote world. So from these attempts at somehow outlining a monist picture, we can already see how due to the dominant vocabulary of dualism, what we often end up doing in monist accounts is using the dualist language and using it in ways that almost seems like we're violating or at least bending the rules of grammar and whatever syntax. So when we talk about the world in monism, it's always it's kind of, we're kind of using a word that comes from the dualist picture of mind-world gap, subject-object divide, and we use that word and we use it in a way where we use it in a different way that seems for a dualist to violate the way that the meaning of the word, or somehow the appropriate way to use the word. So we'll have this, we'll encounter these somewhat odd formulations here and there in these chapters on monism, and they are to some extent a necessity, or at least a result, a somewhat necessary result of the dominance of dualism, just because we are lacking a vocabulary that lends itself better to monism. So we oftentimes resort to using dualist vocabulary and then use it in a somewhat strange way to kind of convey how we are doing things differently from dualism in monism. And maybe a first crack in the egg of monism would be the formulation that the production of knowledge somehow is intrinsically linked with the production of the world. So this formulation itself, the production of the world, is already one example for which would be completely nonsensical for a dualist, and would in some ways even violates the notion of world as it is derived from a dualist vocabulary. But that's the kind of in some sense, I guess it's the only approach that we have in order to kind of flesh out dualism. So bottom line, the production of knowledge is somehow the production of the or a world. So the key challenge for all monist accounts will then be to offer a radically different approach, an approach radically different from all dualist accounts. So let's just recap quickly what the dualists, like all the different strands of dualists basically share, which is the mind-world split, which is the subject-object divide, Cartesian anxiety, call it what you will. But in the end, all dualist accounts basically come down to a separation between the researcher and his world, and the world. I have to correct myself here already, because actually all these other ways of, whether you call it our world or his world or a world or many worlds, that's already that already goes in the direction of monist ways of reframing the dualist world. For dualists, there's just the world and researchers, and they have to somehow, or even normal human beings, we somehow have to acquire knowledge of the world out there. And then specifically when doing science, we want to make sure that the knowledge that we form corresponds to reality as it is out there. So there are all kinds of and I mean, Jackson has himself already outlined two very radically different ways of approaching that dualist, like within this same dualist commitment to the mind world splits, how you can approach that very differently. However, monists really have to offer a radically different approach. And that kind of brings us to this first part of the chapter, which is called Dissolving Descartes. So, foreshadowing the conclusion of this part, and we'll quickly go through the steps, but the basic point is that for a monist, it's not about successfully bridging the mind-world gap, but it's about dissolving that very setup. So that's also why Jackson calls it dissolving Descartes. So somehow what monists do with this challenge, with this dualist challenge, is they dissolve it by pointing out that this challenge, this problem itself, only arises from its own starting points and is not a necessity. And we'll see how they get there. So let's quickly run through some of these big names that Jackson throws in here, to kind of outline the course of philosophical history to get us to monism. So starting with Hobbes, there's already an idea of rejecting the possibility of apprehending anything in itself or things in themselves. And there are two nice quotes. One is, "For true and false are attributes of speech, not of things." So we are moving away from a realm of correspondence. So true and false in correspondence are really about a true correspondence is if what I say matches the world out there. We're moving away from that and we're moving to a paradigm of validity where really true and false have nothing, don't even have anything to do with what is out there, and we start questioning what that would even mean if something was out there and if that even is meaningful. But truth and falsity are only about are only in the realm of speech. So we're moving towards validity rather than correspondence. So it's all within my spoken account that we can establish truth and falsity, and there's no sense of talking about correspondence here. So this is the first this is kind of the first time that this notion of practical utility, that knowledge is ultimately just practically useful, that shows up. Then I mean we can move. I'm not gonna go into detail on all of these big names, but Locke basically introducing the notion of or emphasizing the notion of practical familiarity, so that in our everyday doing we are familiar with how to do things. So knowledge is in the first place practical. This is also kind of then Hume has an even richer account of that, so that we learn from experience, and that in many ways the way we form knowledge is very much like animals form knowledge. So actually, for the first time, we're getting to a point where reasoning and inference look like odd cases of knowledge production. So for the most part, the way we produce knowledge is exactly by learning from experience, and so the knowledge. So we're putting knowledge back in the realm of like practical utility and everyday doing. Then we have Immanuel Kant, who introduced the notion of universal reason. Basically, in his account, the way we perceive the world is already pre-structured by a priori categories. For instance, extension and sequence, temporal sequence. So if we didn't have these a priori categories that are a priori, meaning before experience. So before experience, we already have categories into which experience, or in which experience then can show up. So there is for the first time this notion that that experiencing is not merely a blank, an empty cabinet turned towards the world, a tabula rasa, but it's really experiencing, sensing itself requires input from the experiencer. So somehow if it wasn't for these a priori categories, there wouldn't be any way for us to make sense of experience. And so there is a notion of knowledge being that we can acquire knowledge, and that things necessarily appear to us in a certain way due to these a priori categories, but this knowledge that we can form about how the world necessarily reveals itself to us never penetrates to the things in themselves, because sensation is always already necessarily mediated through these a priori categories. So even though the attempts of these great thinkers to, in a sense, answer to and maybe overcome Cartesian anxiety, um, have given us some of the notions, some of the useful notions that I've mentioned, and which then certainly also, in some sense, inform monism, and maybe we could argue prepared the stage. I think Jackson would argue that they weren't really successful in truly overcoming Descartes, overcoming the Cartesian anxiety, and maybe the one who came closest to it, Immanuel Kant, basically ended up saying, there is no way to reach to the things in themselves, but thanks to universal reason, thanks to these a priori categories that structure our experience of the world, there is a very, very reliable basis of experience, which is basically that the world reveals itself to us in a necessary and in a distinct manner that is universal and that we can grasp by this universal faculty of reason. So somehow Kant found, like, without oversimplifying him too much, which we're certainly doing, kind of found like a lukewarm solution to Cartesian anxiety, in the sense that he said, okay, we cannot say anything about the things in themselves, but thanks to universal reason, we all have the world reveals itself to us in the same sense. So let's give to science. Let science do the job of studying the world as it reveals itself to us. And Kant would then say that philosophy is about trying to find trying to study the categories of how the world reveals itself to us, something like that. However, who then really sort of saves the day for Jackson, and drives and kind of a knight in shining armor, rescuing or victoriously introducing monism, in a sense, is then Friedrich Nietzsche, who, I mean, most importantly, he kind of, in a sense, you could say he mocks this European quest for philosophical and scientific certainty. So, whereas many of these other thinkers still tried to gain some sort of solid foundation, Nietzsche kind of throws this quest for certainty overboard and moves into a completely different direction that then, as Jackson would argue, kind of gives birth to monism. So one of the most important notions that Nietzsche introduces is the notion of the substratum, which is linked to what I called the duality, that duality is a secondary process in the reflexivity summary. So look at that and kind of compare what I'll be saying now. That's very similar. So there's a quote, the doer is merely a fiction added to the deed is everything. This is a very popular Nietzsche quote, and I think it's very misleading in the English translation, because it sort of suggests, it misleads us to think the opposite of what it wants to say. In the German, the word for deed is das Tun, which is the nominalization of the verb to do. So I would replace that, and I would say the doer is merely a fiction added to the doing. The doing is everything. So why would I replace that? Because the main idea here is that that somehow, by coming up with this abstract notion of the doer, we forget about the primacy of doing. We forget that life is practice, that these abstract notions, that precisely these abstract distinctions between the doer and the deed are secondary to the process of doing. Just as I said in the reflexivity chapter, that, for instance, for Karl Marx, the worker and the distinction between the worker and the product of labor is secondary to the process of laboring. Yeah, I would edit that quote in that way, because the crucial point here to understand is that we want to go beyond the subject-object divide. We want to go to what I would call primacy of the process, and that duality is a secondary process. So what Nietzsche then gets us to is a different conception of knowledge, where knowledge becomes instrumental. So the way we abstract both the doer and the deed from the activity of doing is a process of knowledge production. So we produce these entities of the doer and the deed, abstracting them from the primary process of the activity of doing, and that is why that's how he gets to this instrumental notion of knowledge. So this is also what he then calls popular morality. So this idea that we then kind of from particular acts of displaying strength, we then sort of assume an almost mythical, transcendental notion of strength in itself, that this person is strong outside of specific acts of strength. So that again he emphasizes the act is primary. So the act of displaying strength in circumstance A and in circumstance B and in circumstance C is primary to this abstract popular moral knowledge that we then create of the strong and the weak and the doer and the deed and so on. So then what knowledge then becomes is a social product. And if we take knowledge to be a social product, we have to evaluate it in terms of its contributions to life. So knowledge becomes something, so we move away from correspondence to a truth out there, but by seeing that we add, that this notion of the substratum, that we add the doer and the deed to the doing, we then realize that the way we construct this knowledge is always instrumental, always is always ethical in a sense. So from Nietzsche's notion of popular morality and this sort of knowledge production, we then arrive at a very different picture. So knowledge then becomes consensus that arises practically and pragmatically, and representation is always misrepresentation. So there is nothing but misrepresentation. What we always do when we form knowledge is we misrepresent our experience in instrumental ways, and therefore all communication becomes lying all of a sudden. So we really throw overboard any sort of meaning of or any sort of role that correspondence could play. There's really nothing that our knowledge could correspond to. It always hangs in the air, and that's why we can move forward to say, okay, if it's already hanging in the air without any firm grounds to rest on, then what we should do instead is to make sure that it is instrumental and useful, and that we acknowledge it as what it is, which is a pragmatic ordering of reality. So that's the point where Nietzsche would then say that that all the truths that we believe in are really just solidified metaphors. So they were introduced at some point as metaphors where there was still a sense of awareness for them being really misrepresentations, practical and useful misrepresentations, surely, but and then over time they solidified, and now they have taken on kind of a life of their own. I quickly want to point out what language then becomes. So if we talk about practically and usefully organizing our experience, language is always about making sense. So it's really in this. It's almost like language, like the distinction between communication and miscommunication disappears. All communication is miscommunication, or all miscommunication is communication. But it's really about language shapes meaning. Language makes sense, rather than, maybe a neo-positivist would say, in the best case, language corresponds to the meaning that is already out there in the world. So we abandon this idea, and then the worth of any formulation, of any account, really lies in its usefulness and not in its universal validity. And this is then how for Jackson, and I guess also for Nietzsche, the Cartesian anxiety vanishes. Because if, quoting Nietzsche here again, if nature is acquainted with no forms and no concepts, so that's his quote, then there is no point of trying to establish correspondence between the forms and the concepts that we come up with, because there aren't any out there. So that's kind of bringing us full circle then with dissolving Cartesian anxiety. Access to the world is always mediated, and we're never able to answer any questions definitively. It's all the answers that we can give at any point are metaphorical misrepresentations that are at best useful, and we use language to make sense of things. So we're still not done with losing the dualist dog that is chasing us on this quest. So after all this, after this lengthy attempt to sort of establish monism, the problem that then arises is, all right, so you want to produce knowledge pragmatically and instrumentally. How is that not completely? How is that not arbitrary then? How is that not? How do you not fall into subjectivism or idealism? And now I'll quickly try to go into some of the highlights of the lengthy defense that Jackson lays out in front of us. So starting with part of the conclusion again, I think it helps to, if not equate, at least link two notions here. So on the one hand, for monists, somehow knowing and doing are intricately intertwined and maybe the same, and or always have to do with each other. And the same, I would say, goes for the notions of true and helpful. So somehow what a monist would call true is always has to do with being helpful, or might even in fact be evaluated. So truth might even, quote unquote, truth might even be evaluated in terms of its helpfulness. So the strongest weapon then that monists wield for their defense against the dualist charge of either subjectivism or idealism is the notion of intersubjectivity. So since monists always begin with practical involvements and then sort of liken practical involvements to games, or at least concede that practical involvements are always intersubjective in the sense that they are rule governed, that therefore knowledge that is useful in practical involvements can never be simply arbitrary, just like a tactic in a board game, for instance. Let's say we play a board game and someone introduces what they claim to be valuable knowledge to me. That knowledge can never be simply arbitrary because the game itself is rule governed. So this knowledge somehow has to conform to the playing field, the scope that is delineated by the rules, by the nature of the game itself. So somehow the key idea here is that the practical involvement is not simply me doing something in a subjectivist way, but practical involvements are always larger than individuals. So there's some sense of there being some sort of set of rules, and rules here by no means should be misunderstood to mean some sort of like explicit manual of written rules or something. It's really could be social convention, but somehow the idea is that the way I play is not up to my own subjective whims, but is always constrained by the playing field, by the rules that govern my activities, and therefore every piece of knowledge I can produce that can be helpful to navigate this playing field is always necessarily can never be arbitrary in the sense of being just a subjectivist whim of an individual, but always has to sort of be in relation to the playing field itself, and therefore is always necessarily intersubjective. So then, since rules provide an impersonal standard that gives rise to this notion of intersubjectivity, that is, however, never a universal standard. Just like I cannot leave this board game in front of me and then apply the same standards to the conversation I have with my friend in the kitchen. That's a different game. So somehow we are in the space between universal objective validity that would be too much, and subjectivists individualistic arbitrariness would be too little. So we're in that space in between, and therefore rules provide a solid enough basis for practically reasoning your way to good knowledge. So once you know the rules of a game well, you can practically reason your way to a good strategy, for instance. And that is where we then turn from correspondence, that is the key notion for dualists. We turn away from correspondence and we turn to conformity. So conformity implies a certain quote-unquote orientation towards the rules. So rules are always in a sense, I would say semi-flexible. So there's always some wiggle room. It's never completely like rules construct a playing field, but there's in a sense there's always in a complex enough game. That's why good games are fun, because in a complex enough game there's always some wiggle room to devise new strategy, to produce new knowledge, to then be able to better navigate that same game. So that is how monists then move away from the world of things, quote unquote, to what Jackson calls the world of facts. And what a fact then becomes in the monist picture is something very different from what a fact would be to a dualist. A dualist fact would be about correspondence to the world out there, whereas a fact in the monist sense then becomes a particular ordering of reality in terms of theoretical interests. So it's about this conformity, this orientation towards the rules, with a strategy in mind of navigating the game better. So moving on to this notion of plurality of knowledge, or knowledge as that's already a weird word, but so monism can then also at the same time entertain the notion of relative truth or relative truths of different sets of knowledge. And I would say, continuing the metaphor that I kind of introduced in the previous slide with the game, I would say there are two ways of plurality. So the one would then in this metaphor would then be different strategies within the same game, and the other would be different strategies in different games. So somehow this first being about, let's say we play a board game and it's a complex board game with many rules, so there can be a variety of strategies. You adopt one strategy, I adopt a different strategy, and they both have a certain truth claim, in the sense of truth being about utility and practical application, and they are both, of course, oriented towards victory in some sense, and we can then kind of, since the game is complex, with some rivaling strategies, we might at some point say, okay, yours does much better than mine, because you included much more of the subtleties of the game, and the knowledge that you constructed is just more useful. Or we could end up saying they are just two strategies that are different but incomprisable, and sometimes you win, sometimes I win, and they are just different ways of going about playing, but they both conform to the rules. In the other sense, talking about two different games and then talking about different strategies would then be completely incomprisable in a certain sense. I mean, talking about, like, let's say, talk about chess and Monopoly. Like, you can have a strategy in chess and you can be very good in chess, but then once it comes to Monopoly, that strategy doesn't get you anywhere, because the pieces of the game and the whole setup of the game is so different that maybe some more abstract insights can help you to devise a new strategy in this new game, but the strategies in chess and strategies in Monopoly are simply incomprisable, and at the same time they're valuable. So somehow then chess and Monopoly would then stand for different languages of navigating the social sphere, and within those different languages, very very different sets of knowledge become valuable, and they're not, you cannot simply translate one into the other. So that would then for me be the second notion of there being a possibility for relative truth and for a plurality of knowledge or knowledges. So to move a step away from this overly simplistic metaphor, we can then say that different ways of talking can be relatively true because there is no way to compare them to the things in themselves. So since we don't have this point that we want to establish correspondence to, there can be there is a possibility for mutually exclusive and even mutually exclusive and contradictory theories to stand or hold up simultaneously. The condition for this would be that they both provide useful insights. This notion of quote-unquote ways of talking then also allows us to segue into the importance of the positionality or the rootedness or location of the researcher. There's this quote from Wittgenstein that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. So there is an important sense of there being no voice from nowhere. So because in analyticism, and I would say generally in monism, we always start with practical activity, and not simply because we have to, but on the basis of us always already being practically involved in the world and already doing things in the world, that actually gives us a lot of useful insight, and that already provides us with a language that then allows us to speak in certain ways and allows us to generate certain knowledges, certain sets of knowledge about that world, so to speak. So what we end up with then is the analyticist methodology of ideal typification, which is the way that analyticists go about producing that type of practical and useful these useful insights. Ideal types are always about, as Max Weber would say, lending the world its meaning. So what monism does is that it reconceptualizes the social sciences, at least in our context, in the present context, reconceptualizes the social sciences as productive. So concepts and theories are instrumental idealizations, and they're always about comprehending events, comprehending what is happening, rather than predicting. And therefore, they are also always provisional and purpose-driven. So making sense of things, of events, well, things is misleading here again, but bear with me. Making sense of events is always pragmatic and practical and about usefulness. So that already contains a notion of purpose-drivenness. So why would we make sense of something if we didn't have a purpose? So what would be the point of making sense if there wasn't some sort of goal in this for us? And this is really, in many ways, the dualist nightmare, because dualists and neo-positivists especially want to achieve the exact opposite. So they want to achieve not provisional, but at best everlasting and precisely not purpose-driven, but a objective and and impartial claims. Also, reflexivists pick up on this goal orientation, but in a very different way. So if you want to know more about that, jump to the video on reflexivism. And but still, both, so we can see that both these monist methodologies have a certain orientation towards more or less pragmatic ends. So they want to achieve something which is not just knowledge about things as they are in themselves for the sake of knowing them, but they want to achieve a certain ordering of the world that is productive, because all our knowing is derived from and inspires doing, and is kind of in this very organic relationship with doing. So therefore, the only honest way to go about it is to then be pragmatic and practical and utility oriented. So to wrap up, what analyticism then wants to achieve is to generate insights that are useful and that come in the form of these ideal types, which are in a sense caricatures. So they are useful oversimplifications of events that might generate insights. And these ideal types can never be falsified. The only thing that we can do with ideal types is either find them useful or useless. So we can keep them as long as they generate insights that we deem useful, and we can discard them as soon as we don't find them useful anymore. And last but certainly not least, and I won't spend much time on this, but this is actually one of the most crucial points, is that analyticism then culminates in singular causal analyses. So since the point of knowledge production is to lend the world its meaning, and the social sciences being productive and instrumental, we want to comprehend specific a specific series of, or a specific case of events in a pragmatic way. We want to comprehend it. We want to make sense of a certain event or a chain of events, and therefore analyticism really focuses on these singular causal analyses where we then generate case-specific narratives. So it's really about, in a pragmatic sense, creating a narrative structure of how the events hang together in this specific sense, in this specific case, and the paradigm within which this case-specific narrative is always evaluated is plausibility. So is this narrative plausible? Is it plausible that the factors that we highlight or the factors that we identify were very important in the events coming about in the way they did? And therefore, analyticists then talk about the configuration of factors. So these case-specific narratives are always about a specific configuration, so a specific setup and working together, a model of a variety of causal factors and how they work together to produce the outcomes, the events that we've seen. And the important question that we want to ask ourselves is always whether a causal factor, whether we can imagine the outcome without this factor, or whether it's inconceivable to us to leave out this factor. That is really this notion of plausibility, that it's really about can we leave this out? Would the outcome have been the same? So In conclusion, ideal types are means for constructing case-specific explanations, which come in the form of these case-specific narratives, and ideal types are not ends in themselves. They're always tools, they're always pragmatically oriented towards generating meaning, lending the world its meaning. All right. There's surely plenty more to say about analyticism, but I think this summary provides an overview of some of the philosophical and methodological underpinnings of monism in general, and giving some of the most important starting points for understanding where monists and analyticists in this specifically are coming from, and especially in contrast with the summaries on reflexivity, I think they function well together to provide a guide to these chapters. So I hope this is helpful. I think this links up nicely with the summaries on reflexivity, so feel free to check them out and stay posted for more.